Hi, BookTube. I'm back in my reading corner here in the bedroom, and I've been reading through one of the editions of the Colophon. This is the summer 1935 issue. And first of all, I read the great opening article on America's First Bibles, which then led me back to one of my old favorites, The Greatest Book in the World by my beloved A. Edward Newton, which led me to 55 pages of the history of the publishing of the Bible in English. But I moved on from that to the second article in here, which is by Oscar Wegland, and it's titled Herman Melville, as I recall him. And it's just a short article of about 4 pages, and I enjoyed it so much that I thought some of you here on BookTube might enjoy hearing it read as well. So I'm going to read it aloud to you. This is Herman Melville as I recall him. Late one afternoon in the autumn of 1890, an old gentleman preceded by a beard that was impressive even for those hirsute days, walked into the bookshop of John Anderson, Jr. at 99 Nassau Street, New York, where the author of these notes was employed as a boy of all work. A neighboring bookseller, it appeared, had directed the visitor to Mr. Anderson as likely to have a copy of a certain title which the visitor sought. If I remembered the title of that particular book, you may be sure I should give it here. I recall only that it was concerned with the sea. I do not even recall whether the Anderson shop was able to supply it, but I do recall that a conversation was opened between Mr. Anderson and the newcomer, a conversation about the sea and sailors that soon included as an audience the browsers in the shop and the boy of all work. For it was very evident that the stranger knew considerably more about those who went down to the sea in ships, and the sort of ships they went down in, than anyone we had ever listened to. At last, Mr. Anderson, giving voice to a curiosity that was consuming all of us, inquired, "By the way, sir, you have not given me your name. To whom do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" "My name is Herman Melville," said the visitor. Mr. Anderson raised his hands in delighted surrender. "That explains it," he said. It was the beginning of a brief but pleasant friendship between the pair, until a short time before his death, the following September 28th, at his home, 104th East 26th Street. Melville was a frequent visitor at the Anderson shop. On at least one occasion, Mr. Anderson visited the Melville home and met Mrs. Melville. It was my own good fortune several times in those months to be the bearer of bundles of books to the Melville house. Some of them were copies of his own sea tales, of which, oddly enough, he seemed to have virtually no copies until Mr. Anderson supplied them. When the author was at home, I was certain to receive a modest but welcome tip, an offering wholeheartedly appreciated by a apprentice bookseller who was drawing $3 a week. If I had only the foresight to take up a few copies of his books on my own account and ask him to inscribe them. Moreover, if it had occurred to me at that time that the man to whom I delivered those parcels was destined to be an unequivocal immortality, and that I would someday be setting down these few scraps of reminiscence concerning him, I suppose I should have taken down the names of the books, the dates of their delivery, and the prices paid for them. What an admirable, utterly useless thing is hindsight. I do recall enough about those books to be able to report that Melville was hardly a collector in the sense in which the term is employed today. There was a report current in the book trade at the time that he spent more of his slender income on books than his family liked, but plenty of people before and since who were not of Melville's literary stature have done and are still doing the same. Melville's was a reader's and a student's library. The depth of his reading is evident to anyone who had opened Moby Dick and noted the list of whaling authorities cited at the beginning. That, unfortunately, was well before my time. I cannot pose as the Mercury who brought him the source material for his great classic. Melville, as I recall him, was slightly below the average in stature, and walked with a rapid stride and almost a sprightly gait. He could be depended upon to wear a low-crowned hat and almost invariably a blue suit. I particularly recall his gentleness of manner and his pleasant smile. I never found him to be the misanthrope that many authorities accuse him of having been. It is difficult for me to believe that he was a disappointed man. If he was, he did not permit his disappointment to come out into the open. The fact is, I think, borne out in the letters constituting the family correspondence of Herman Melville, New York, 1929, edited by Victor Hugo Palsetz from the originals in the Gansevoort Lansing collection in the New York Public Library. Mr. Palsetz asked me to read these letters and tell him if I thought the writer of them could be regarded as an embittered man. After reading them, I told him I did not think so. Certainly Melville in 1890 had every right to feel embittered so far as his fame as an author was concerned, but I doubt if he was. He has always appeared to me, in the lengthening perspective since my brief acquaintance with him nearly half a century since, to have been a man who preferred being alive and neglected to being dead and famous. Whether he liked people or simply made believe he did, masking his real self in the presence of a bookseller and his youthful assistant, I am certain that he loved New York. He would take long walks in those latter months, voyaging as far afield as Central Park, a promenade which I doubt if many residents of East 26th Street indulge in today. Some time after Melville's death, Mrs. Melville requested Mr. Anderson's assistance in the disposal of his library. Mr. Anderson himself bought a few of the books among them. I remember the few remaining copies of John Marr and Timoleon which Melville had printed respectively in 1888 and 1891, in editions of 25 copies each. No one knew at the time that these two trifles would become the crown jewels of Melville items. Mr. Anderson could not use the bulk of the library, which was a large one for the time, and Mrs. Melville asked him to send someone to her who might be interested in buying the rest. Mr. Anderson called on Thomas E. Keene, who had a bookshop at 25 Ann Street, and who offered $100. Mrs. Melville, greatly disappointed, asked Mr. Anderson to suggest someone else. He then sent A.F. Farnell, at that time a well-known Brooklyn dealer, who raised the Keene offer $10. Mrs. Melville reluctantly accepted it. Now, the details of this transaction, of course, must be read in the light of the early 1890s. No one then appreciated the fact that mere proof of Melville's ownership of it would make a book a sought-for item a generation later, and many of the books contained his signature. Considered, however, even as a mere cartload of second-hand books, the library was a bargain, and two proofs of that fact survive. One is that some time later, Farnell told Mr. Anderson that he regarded the deal as one of the best buys of his career, because the books sold with what in the book trade passes for rapidity. Will the reader permit me to step back into the role of the bookseller for a moment and remind him that if a bookseller pays a dime for a book, which he forthwith marks $1, he is out that dime until he sells the book, and the book may remain on his shelf for 15 years? The other proof is the fact that Keene, thinking his offer over, decided it was too low, hired a wagon, went back to the Melville home, found the books gone, and visited the Anderson bookshop in considerable dungeon. It was his own fault, however, that he did not get the books. Of the few selections from Melville's library which Mr. Anderson purchased, several went into the fine collections of Thomas J. McKee, Henry C. Sturgis, and Daniel Parrish, Jr. I have often tried to reconstruct the scene of Melville's first visit to the Anderson bookshop, but I can add only one detail to what I have already written. Among the customers present was Frederick S. Ryer, whose name and memory are familiar to many collectors of dramatic engravings, playbills, and related stage material generally. Mr. Ryer was a member of a group that even at that time was moving from scarce to rare. He was a genuine old-time New Yorker, a volunteer fireman of ancient vintage, a character generally, and in the 1890s, one of the best-known book and print collectors in the metropolis. He had both time and money to spend in bookshops, and he spent both with a lavishness that Herman Melville might well have envied. And that is the end of that article by Oscar Weglin, published here in the Colophon Summer 1935 edition. So I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did read